It's been about a couple weeks now since I covered the parental rights protest in Kitchener, and this was one of many protests that were happening across Canada. And it was started by some faith groups, I think specifically Muslim Canadians, who are upset about what they see as trans indoctrination of their children in the public school system. And they were basically protesting several policies across the country where school boards tend to promote what they see as pro-trans or pro-LGBT views in school. And it's a complicated matter to even discuss. And in this video, I want to talk a little bit about trans rights versus charter rights. Recently, in a couple of provinces, first in New Brunswick and more recently in Saskatchewan, provincial governments have passed policies or legislation, I think, I'm not sure which one it is exactly, but they've introduced policies that basically guarantee that parents will be notified if and when their child wants to use a different name or a different pronoun, or to basically be treated as though they're a member of the opposite sex in school. And this has got a lot of people riled up on both sides, frankly. There are people who feel that policies like this are basically infringing on the rights of children to have privacy from their parents. And then on the other side, there are parents who believe that they have the right to know when their child is, if and when their child says that they're transitioning or want to be referred to as a pronoun other than the one that reflects their sex. This is a complicated matter, and it's definitely one that polarizes a lot of people, just watching some of the things on Twitter. But in this video, I want to talk specifically about trans rights versus charter rights. And as I understand it, this is kind of complicated, but in Saskatchewan specifically, there was a group, it's a trans activist group or trans rights group that challenged the government's policy that would force school boards to let parents know when their children are using a different pronoun. And they've challenged this in court, and the court recently ruled, and I don't know that they've said exactly that it's unconstitutional, but that it issued an injunction that would, I guess, they want to look at it more, is sort of how I understand it. And most recently, the Saskatchewan government, or the premier specifically, has said he will use the notwithstanding clause in the charter to get around this. And there's people who feel that this is infringing on children's rights. To me, it seems patently absurd that children have full charter rights. I mean, clearly they don't, certainly not in practice. The charter guarantees a number of different things. I'm no expert on the charter, but one of the things it guarantees, as I understand it, is freedom of association, that we can associate with whomever we want. Clearly, a 7-year-old, if he wants to go to someone else's house and his parents say, no, you've got to come in for dinner, or you need to go to bed, or I don't want you hanging around with that person for whatever reason, clearly the child doesn't have, unfettered freedom of association. Nor do they have unfettered freedom of movement. Again, using the bedtime example, they want to go out and play, and the parent says, no, it's bedtime. The parent's will gets to win out, irrespective of what the charter says. So on the face, clearly children do not have charter rights, at least in the same way full-grown adults do. Now, I don't know what the jurisprudence is on this. I'm not sure if there's been rulings over the years about what sort of rights do apply to children in the charter and what ones don't. That would be interesting. But clearly they don't have these full rights, at least in practice, whether or not in law. And yet a lot of people are saying that these policies that Saskatchewan and New Brunswick, not sure about Manitoba, but there's been talk of having more parental rights. And I guess my feeling on this is, in general, although there are some bad parents, in general, parents know best, what's right for their children. And I think it's a little bit scary that there's a lot of people out there that believe that the state overall knows best. Now, I acknowledge I've done foster care. My wife and I have done foster care. We've retired somewhat recently last year, but we did it for about 11 years, and we had I think roughly 25 children in our home at various times, some for as short as 3 weeks, some almost 3 years. Sometimes we had, I think, as many as 4 foster kids in our home at one time. So we've got some experience working with the foster care system. And clearly that's an example where in some extreme cases, the state does remove children from their parents' home when it's deemed unsafe, or there's a variety of reasons why that would happen. So I do acknowledge that there are some very rare cases where the state does need to step in. But in general, parents should have the right to determine how to raise their children, how to teach them, especially when it comes to their religious or moral upbringing. I think that's something that's best vested primarily with the parents themselves. What I find a little bit frightening and chilling about this whole discussion, and I noticed this in talking to some of the trans activists, I can't remember if this came out in the interviews that were part of my live stream. I think they did, or maybe it was alluded to, but this idea that from the trans people's perspective, or the trans activists that were at these protests, they felt that the protesters on the other side, that, how do I put this? They really felt that the religious parents were harming their children by potentially not allowing them to be trans, or again, it was kind of vague, but there was this undercurrent that just children being in homes with parents who don't follow the trans ideology, that in itself is somehow dangerous for children. And that whole line of thinking, I think, is one that we have to be very careful with, because it's a very small step from there to saying we need to remove children from their homes only because their parents don't support this trans agenda. And I think there's, again, not all the activists, I mean, some of them were more reasonable than others, if you saw it. There's a whole variety of different views on that side. But there's at least some that have this, what they think is a legitimate fear that parents who aren't into the trans ideology are, just by definition, by holding those views, are unfit parents, or that children need to be protected from those parents. In doing foster care, one thing that I noticed, that my wife and I noticed, and we dealt with, not with every child, but with a number of children that were in our care, we were able to get to know their biological parents to varying degrees, sometimes over Zoom, sometimes in person. Oftentimes, children in foster care are afforded visits with their biological parents or parent, and it really depends on the situation, not in every case, but in a handful of cases that we had. And we got to know some of these parents a little bit, or as much as you can, I guess. And so these are parents that I guess the state had determined wasn't able to care for their children as well as they could. And it crossed a threshold where the state decided to remove the children from their care. And I don't know the particulars, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with, that's a whole other debate, is under what circumstances might you remove a child. But my point in this is that with every parent that I kind of got to know or that I interacted with, it seemed to me that in their heart of hearts, they wanted what was best for their children. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here, is that in general, even the parents that aren't the best parents generally do, will the good of their children, and are perhaps incapable of providing what they want their children to have. But that desire, I think, is generally good across the vast number of parents that are out there. Similarly, I think school teachers, guidance counselors, principals, and I know some of these people personally, like outside of school, the vast, vast majority of them are good people, in my opinion, and have good intentions with children. In both populations of parents and teachers, there is a very small number, unfortunately, that might harm a child. It's unfortunate, it's not pleasant to think about, but statistically it exists. Just on a balance of probabilities, however, if it comes up to, do we trust, if you had to place your full trust in one or the other, I would say that parents overall are going to treat their children better than your average, school administrator, guidance counselor, etc. Again, not to say that these aren't great people by and large, they are, but if you're going to look at the very small number that might do something that would be harmful to a child, it's statistically going to be the non-parent over the parent. So when it comes to these parental rights, I think it is important that parents have a voice in how their children are being, treated in school. I mean, lots of people have mentioned this, but just going on a field trip, we need to have a permission form to take photos. Again, with getting back to the foster care, it was fairly strict, and we had to point this out to a couple schools a couple times, where the policy is that they can't have their pictures taken, which I think is a good policy. But so there's these sorts of things that the parent, or in my case the guardian, has a say in these sorts of things. And I think it is better that these decisions are vested with the parent and not with school boards, teachers, counselors, principals, no matter how good or well-intentioned those people might be. It's ultimately the parents who have the right and responsibility of raising their children. In some of these protests, I think there are some signs, but this discussion about, and I can't remember which side started it exactly, but this idea that, who owns the children, and parents don't own the children, and the school board doesn't own the children. And of course, no one owns a child exactly. We don't use that terminology. You don't own a child the way you own, a car or a house. But parents do have the responsibility, the stewardship to raise the children, to protect them, to teach them, to guide them, to prepare them for life as best they can and as best they know. And that looks very different for very different parents, depending on their culture, their religion, their own experience. But I think we go down a dangerous path if we start saying that the state or a school board or a teacher knows better than parents when it comes to raising children. Let me know what you think, and also about this trans issue in general. One big question that's on my mind, and it might be on yours, is for Christians specifically, and whether you're a Christian or not, I'd love to hear from you. How ought we deal with this trans issue, especially as it relates to children in schools, and specifically for those of us who consider ourselves Christians? What's the right Christian response to this? Christians get a lot of things wrong, and we have got a lot of things wrong over the centuries. Christians fall short of the glory of God just as everyone does. So I think there's lots of ways we can get this issue wrong, but I'm curious what you think. What are some of the things we can do as Christians or as non-Christians, so people who have various, moral frameworks to life? What can we do to respond to what seems to be this increasing desire by what I would call trans activists to put a certain agenda forward when it comes to raising our children? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.